There's a clay tablet sitting in a museum archive right now that most academics refuse to discuss in public, not because it is damaged, not because it is too fragmentary to translate, but because what it describes, when read without the filter of modern assumptions, does not fit the story we have been told about where human beings came from. This tablet, part of a collection of Sumerian texts that predate the Bible by thousands of years, contains a passage referring to two distinct categories of human beings, two separate bloodlines, two different origins. And according to the text, only one of those bloodlines was created by the gods themselves. The other one came from somewhere else entirely. If you have been paying attention to the ancient astronaut research community over the last 2 decades, you have heard pieces of this story before. Zechariah Sitchin pointed to it. Lawrence Gardner traced its echoes through royal genealogies. Researchers like Michael Tellinger and Anton Parks spent years digging through the cuneiform records trying to reconstruct what the original Sumerian scribes were actually saying before their words were absorbed into later religious traditions that could not afford to let the original meaning survive. Most mainstream presentations focus on the Anunnaki as a unified group with a single agenda. What almost nobody talks about is the internal division within their own creation project, the disagreement that produced 2 separate human templates, and the evidence buried in the tablet record that those 2 templates are still walking around today with fundamentally different biological signatures. Before we go further, hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications. This channel covers material that major platforms and academic gatekeepers would rather keep in the footnotes. Every time you subscribe and share, you help this research reach people who are ready to hear it. If you want early access to the deep dives, source breakdowns, and uncensored versions of these investigations, the link to the membership community is in the description below. What we are about to cover gets suppressed and quietly buried. Your support is the only thing keeping it alive. Now let us go back to the beginning. Not the beginning in Genesis. The beginning before Genesis. The one the Sumerians recorded in a language that had no reason to invent metaphors for things it was describing as literal historical events. The civilization that emerged in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley around 5,500 years ago did not appear gradually the way all our models of cultural evolution predict. It exploded. Fully formed writing systems, complex legal codes, astronomical calendars precise enough to track planetary cycles across centuries, agricultural techniques that assume generations of prior knowledge that no archaeological record accounts for, mathematics sophisticated enough to calculate compound interest and geometric land surveys, and embedded in their texts a detailed account of beings they called the Anunnaki, those who from heaven to earth came. Not gods in the abstract theological sense, beings, physical entities who descended from somewhere else, and whose intervention in early human development was recorded not as mythology, but as administrative history. The Sumerian king list, one of the oldest historical documents on the planet, begins with a statement never satisfactorily explained by mainstream scholarship. It says that kingship descended from heaven, that before the Great Flood, specific named rulers governed specific named cities for impossibly long reigns, tens of thousands of years in some cases. Then the flood came, then kingship descended from heaven again, and the post-flood rulers began showing dramatically reduced lifespans. Something changed, something biological, and the Sumerian scribes noticed and recorded it. The text we are focusing on today is not one of the famous creation epics. It is not the Enuma Elish, though that text is relevant context. It is not the Epic of Gilgamesh, though Gilgamesh himself is central to understanding what the 2 bloodlines meant in practical terms. The tablet in question is from a category Sumerian scribes called incantation texts, ritual medical documents inscribed by specialist priest-physicians known as the Ashapu. These were not poets writing mythology. They were practitioners working from technical knowledge about the human body and the invisible forces that could alter human biology. And buried inside one of these incantation texts is a passage translated in at least 3 significantly different ways by 3 different academic scholars, all of whom produce translations that, while technically defensible, soften the most explosive implication of the original cuneiform. The passage describes the blood of 2 kinds of human being. The Sumerian term used is different in each case. In the first instance, the text uses a compound term combining the word for clay or earth with the word for blood or life fluid. In the second, the compound combines the word for heaven or above with the same root, earth blood and heaven blood. The mundane translation most academic papers prefer renders this as common human vitality versus divine spark, a poetic dualism, metaphor, symbolism. But here is where the story gets complicated in ways that cannot be explained by poetic convention. The incantation in which this passage appears is a medical procedure, a set of instructions for a healer dealing with a patient whose blood is not responding to treatment the way it should. The diagnosis section states, in language that is not remotely poetic, that the healer must first determine which type of blood the patient carries. Because the treatments are different, the ritual components are different, the protective herbs and mineral preparations are different, and the expected outcomes are explicitly stated to differ based on which blood type the patient has. This is not a metaphor. Nobody writes a medical procedure around a metaphor. You do not instruct a physician to perform different interventions on different patients based on a symbolic distinction. The Sumerians were precise people. They built cities with drainage systems. They calculated the retrograde motion of Jupiter. When they wrote a medical text, they meant it as a medical text. And this medical text says that there are 2 biological categories of human being, defined by something in their blood, and that these 2 categories require different treatment protocols. Now let us bring in the creation mythology, because this is where the 2 data streams converge in a way that should make every serious researcher reread the primary sources. The primary Sumerian creation narrative, preserved most fully in the Atrahasis epic, along with parallel passages in the Enuma Elish and several standalone creation hymns, tells a story that differs dramatically from later Mesopotamian and Abrahamic retellings. In the Sumerian original, human beings were not created from nothing. They were not created as a purely spiritual act of divine will. They were engineered. The Anunnaki, led by Enki, the lord of the deep waters and master of the divine technical formulas, combined something of the gods with something of the earth to create a being capable of performing labor. The Sumerian word for this process is related to mixing or combining. It is the same root used in texts describing the preparation of medicinal compounds and metal alloys. This was a technical operation. What was mixed? The texts say the blood of a god was combined with clay. The god whose blood was used is identified in some versions as Kingu, a divine being killed or sacrificed in the events preceding the creation. King's blood mixed with clay produced the first Lulu, the first human worker. And that first human was not fully divine and not fully earthly. It was something in between, a hybrid, an engineered composite. But here is what the popular presentations almost always leave out. The Atrahasis epic does not describe a single creation event. It describes multiple creation attempts, failed experiments, prototype humans that were too powerful, too weak, too fertile, or not fertile enough, beings with defects and organs that did not function in standard ways. After multiple rounds of biological iteration, a stable model was produced, the Lulu Amalu, the mixed worker of the gods. That stable model is the ancestor of most of the current human population, the earth blood lineage, a deliberate dilution, because a being too close to the divine template was too difficult to control. Here is where a second thread enters the narrative. Enki, in the Sumerian texts, is not a simple character. He is the craftsman god, the lord of wisdom and deep knowledge, but he is also consistently portrayed as operating outside the consensus of the divine assembly. He hides things. He leaks classified information to humans he has selected. He disobeys directives from his brother Enlil, who represents law, order, and rigid governance. And in several texts, Enki is described as having produced, alone or with collaborators, a secondary human creation, a lineage not produced by the standard mixing protocol, a lineage that received a higher proportion of divine genetic material, more heaven in the blood, less earth. The texts describing this secondary lineage are not as well preserved as the main creation epics. They appear in fragments and side passages and genealogical sections of texts, primarily about something else. But they are consistent enough across multiple independent sources that they cannot be dismissed as scribal invention. These passages describe a specific class of human being that the gods treated differently, longer lived, more perceptive, capable of interacting with the divine technical formulas in ways ordinary humans could not. And their blood, the texts say repeatedly, was not the same as the blood of the mixed worker. The Gilgamesh material is where this distinction becomes impossible to ignore. Gilgamesh, king of Uruk, is described throughout his epic and in separate king list references as being 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. This is a bizarre biological ratio that makes no sense in any allegorical framework and makes complete literal sense if you accept that the texts are describing genetic dilution across generations. If the primary Anunnaki progenitor of his line was fully divine, and if subsequent generations each added human mixture into the bloodline, a 3-generation dilution would produce exactly the 2/3 ratio the text specifies. Gilgamesh's extraordinary strength and endurance are presented not as miraculous divine favor, but as a consequence of his biological composition. He carries more of the original, undiluted, divine template. He is also mortal, and the entire Gilgamesh epic is the story of a being who carries enough divine blood to understand what immortality is, but not enough to achieve it. He watches his companion Enkidu die. He goes to the ends of the earth looking for the plant of immortality. He finds it. He loses it to a serpent. And he returns to Uruk and realizes that his city walls are his only legacy. Despite everything that his heaven blood gave him, the clay in his composition guarantees his death. This is a precise description of a hybrid being grappling with a biological limitation that was engineered into him. Now let us connect this to the medical text. The incantation tablet's 2 blood categories map directly onto the cosmological distinction between the primary mixed creation and the secondary high-proportion divine creation. The earth blood patient requires certain treatments. The heaven blood patient requires different treatments. And the text notes that heaven blood individuals show unusual responses to standard medicinal preparations. That what heals an earth blood person may not heal a heaven blood person, and in some cases, what is neutral for one is harmful for the other. This is a pharmacogenomic observation. It describes what we would today call differential drug response based on genetic variation. The idea that certain populations metabolize compounds differently, respond to treatments differently, show different baseline physiologies, is one of the most active areas of current biomedical research. And the Sumerians, 5,000 years ago, recorded this principle in a medical incantation text because their understanding of human biology included the knowledge that not all humans were made the same way. The modern blood type system is the obvious touch point here, and we need to address it carefully because this is where a lot of alternative history researchers make claims that go beyond what the evidence actually supports. The ABO blood group system divides human blood into 4 primary types based on the presence or absence of specific antigens on the surface of red blood cells. What is genuinely mysterious about blood type distribution in modern human populations is not the existence of different types, but the distribution patterns. Type O is the oldest according to genetic chronology. It appears to be the ancestral human type. Types A and B appear later, with different geographic distributions that suggest different points of origin. And then there is the Rh factor, the positive or negative designation that most people know from their blood type card, but rarely think about in depth. The Rh factor is named after the rhesus monkey because it was first identified through comparison with rhesus monkey blood. Approximately 15% of the human population is Rh negative, meaning they lack the Rh antigen on their red blood cells. The other 85% are Rh positive. The Rh negative population shows a clustering pattern in geographic and genetic ancestry that is statistically anomalous. The highest concentrations appear in the Basque region of Spain and France, in certain isolated populations of the British Isles, and in parts of the Middle East and North Africa. The Basque people have the highest concentration of Rh negative blood of any population on Earth, and they also carry a language, Euskara, that is a complete genetic isolate. It has no known relatives. It did not descend from Indo-European, Semitic, or any other reconstructible ancestral tongue. The Basques appear in the European linguistic record fully formed, speaking a language unlike anything around them, carrying blood unlike anything around them. If you were designing a controlled study to identify the modern descendants of a genetically isolated founding population with unusual ancestry, you would look for exactly these markers: anomalous blood type frequency combined with linguistic isolation combined with geographic clustering. Rh negative blood also creates a specific medical phenomenon that has no satisfying evolutionary explanation. When an Rh negative woman carries an Rh positive fetus, her immune system recognizes the Rh positive factor as foreign and mounts an immune response against it. From an evolutionary perspective, a trait that causes a mother's immune system to attack her own offspring should have been eliminated from the gene pool within a few generations. The fact that 15% of the global population carries this trait suggests either a very recent origin, which genetics does not support, or a protected lineage history that prevented normal evolutionary culling. A founding population isolated enough to maintain the trait across thousands of generations despite its reproductive disadvantage. The ancient astronaut interpretation of this data is straightforward. The Rh negative population represents the modern descendants of the heaven blood lineage described in the Sumerian texts. The lineage created not by the standard mixing protocol, but by the secondary Enki faction project that preserved a higher proportion of the original Anunnaki genetic template. The Rh positive majority represents the descendants of the standard mixed creation, earth blood. Clay and divine substance combined in the proportion designed to produce a functional but controllable worker class. The Rh negative minority carries more of the original undiluted template, and that template, being non-terrestrial in origin, is recognized as foreign by Rh positive immune systems. The Rh positive immune system treats the Rh negative antigen profile as alien, because according to this framework, it is alien. It represents a genetic signature that did not originate in the terrestrial creation process. This is a hypothesis. It needs to be stated clearly as a hypothesis, but it has specific testable implications that current genetics and immunology have not seriously investigated, in part because doing so would require framing the research question in terms that institutional science is not prepared to accept publicly. Now let us look at what happened to the heaven blood lineage over historical time. If these two bloodlines were real, and if the Anunnaki distinction between them was deliberately maintained, you would expect to see it preserved in historical record. You would expect to see the heaven blood lineage receiving special treatment, different rights, different access to knowledge and power, and you would expect to see every subsequent civilization build institutional structures around protecting and managing that distinction. That is exactly what you find. Every ancient Near Eastern civilization that followed Sumer maintained a concept of sacred kingship that was explicitly biological in its justification. The king was not just a political figure. The king was a specific kind of being. His right to rule derived not from appointment or military victory alone, but from blood, from a specific genetic inheritance that made him categorically different from the people he ruled. The Akkadian, Babylonian, Assyrian, and Egyptian royal traditions all preserved this concept in different forms. The pharaoh was a being of divine blood, and in the Egyptian tradition, the elaborate ritual system surrounding the pharaoh was designed not to give him divine power from outside, but to maintain and activate the divine power already encoded in his biology. The bloodline protection mechanisms in ancient royal traditions, the elaborate marriage prohibitions, the endogamous patterns that caused the Ptolemies to marry siblings and cousins for generations, all of these become legible as biological preservation strategies when you understand them through the lens of the two bloodline framework. These were attempts by people who believed themselves to carry a distinct biological inheritance to prevent that inheritance from being diluted back into the majority Earthblood population. Zechariah. Sitchin spent 40 years arguing that the Anunnaki were a physical extraterrestrial species that genetically engineered modern Homo sapiens from earlier hominid stock. The academic establishment dismissed him, largely without engaging his primary source translations, but Sitchin actually underplayed the two bloodline distinction. He focused on the creation of the Lulu as the central event and discussed the extended lifespans of the pre-flood patriarchs in Genesis as evidence of the divine genetic component gradually diluting across generations. He did not fully develop the implications of the medical tablet distinction between Earthblood and Heavenblood as a separate, maintained lineage with its own continuous history. Anton Parks, a chercheur French researcher whose work is less well known in English but significant in alternative history circles, went further. Parks produced a framework that identifies the Heavenblood lineage not as a single pure stream, but as the result of several different Anunnaki factions, each producing their own human variants with different genetic emphasis. The internal diversity within the Rh-negative genetic cluster would be consistent with this model of multiple origins rather than a single founding event. Lawrence Gardner, working from a tradition rooted in Grail bloodline research, arrived at a convergent conclusion. Gardner traced what he called the Starfire tradition through royal bloodlines from Sumer, through Egypt, through the Israelite royal house, through the Merovingian dynasty, and into the present. The Starfire tradition, according to Gardner's research, was a biological sacrament, the transmission of divine genetic material from the higher proportion divine bloodline to initiates and rulers seeking to maintain their own divine biological content. Gardner's framework is the most explicit in treating the Heavenblood distinction as a physical genetic reality that ancient civilizations built entire institutional systems around managing and protecting. None of this is in the standard curriculum. None of it is discussed in peer-reviewed journals. But the primary source material these researchers draw on is real. The tablets exist. The translations are working from actual cuneiform records. The pattern that emerges from independent researchers across different methodological traditions arriving at consistent conclusions about a two-bloodline distinction cannot be dismissed as fringe speculation without engaging the actual source material. The question of what this means for people living today is one that most researchers approach with considerable care. The implication that human beings fall into two distinct biological categories with different origins has historically been weaponized in horrifying ways. The concept of divine bloodlines has been used to justify aristocratic oppression and every species of human evil requiring a biological justification. That history demands that anyone approaching this material take the ethical dimensions seriously, but suppressing the question does not make the evidence disappear. The Rh incompatibility data is real. The anomalous Basque population genetics are real. The Sumerian medical text distinction between Earthblood and Heavenblood is real. The ancient royal traditions of every major civilization in the Near East and Mediterranean are still organized around biological divine inheritance in ways that fit the two-bloodline model more precisely than any other explanatory framework. The Sumerians wrote down what they knew, in a language designed for precision, on a medium designed to last, in a form suggesting they expected it to be read by people who needed it for practical purposes. They were not writing mythology. They were writing records. And one of those records says, plainly enough for anyone willing to read it without flinching, that the human population contains two distinct biological types, and only one of them was made by the gods in the standard creation process. The other one was made differently, carries different blood, responds to the world differently, and is still here. That is not a comfortable conclusion, but the Sumerians were not in the business of comfort. They were in the business of recording what was true, in clay, so it would survive. 5,000 years later, it has. The only question is whether we are ready to read it for what it actually says.